Happy 4th of July, and let's have a history story time with Matt from the American War of Independence. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, and today we're going to have a tale from the American War of Independence involving swords between a famous American and a famous British officer. Now, accounts of hand-to-hand combat from the Revolutionary Wars are actually not very common for various reasons. They're actually not that well documented compared to later conflicts. However, there are some examples, so I've picked one famous example from here to suit this day, the 4th of July. And once again, I want to wish a happy Independence Day to all of my American friends and viewers out there. And, you know, many times I wish that I could declare independence from the United Kingdom as well these days. But that's a different topic for a different video. So I am holding a sword that is not totally irrelevant to the video here, because this is a sword from the 1760s, 1770s for a British officer. It's got King George's cipher down on the side there. Very, very nice sword. And this is the type of sword that would have been carried at this time. It's not necessarily representative of the sword that is carried in this encounter, and I'll show you why in a minute. But nevertheless, this is the type of sword that dragoons and some infantry officers carried at this time. And if you did want to delve down the subject of swords of the Revolutionary War, then indeed you need to look at British swords of this period, but also French swords as well, because of course there were French soldiers and officers on the American side. Or the revolutionary side, shall we call it, depending how you look at it. And so there would have been French and British swords, and others. There would have been Spanish and other swords as well on the American side. On the British side, of course, this is pre-patterns. So this is the pre-1788 pattern. So swords like this, they were more regimentally specific rather than nationally specific at this point. So the models and patterns that I often refer to don't come in until after this war. So I'm going to be reading today from D.A. Kinsley's Swordsman of the British Empire, and in this case it's the swordsman of the American military against a swordsman of the British Empire. And I wrote the foreword to this book incidentally as well, so it's by D.A. Kinsley and there's an introduction by me in it, published many years ago now. I'll stick a link down below, you can get it on Lulu. So this is an account of an encounter between Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, quite a famous person, commander of the Royal Legion, and Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, who's George's cousin. So not George Washington, William Washington. And he was the commander of the 1st and 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, so both cavalrymen. And this is at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina in 1781. Now, before I delve into this, I should just mention, as a true historian should do, that obviously these accounts contain bias, and they also contain conflicting versions of the story. So this is a famous encounter which is actually recounted in a few different sources and retold several times, and so there are different versions of how this panned out. However, there are some common features to it. It's actually got a surprising amount of consistency, even down to an injury that's sustained. There's some debate around what the nature of the injury was, but let's delve into the story, or at least one version of it. So this version's from the historical record of the 17th Regiment of Light Dragoons, 1841. So not a huge amount of time after the event, a couple of generations. So when Colonel Washington formed for a second charge at the Battle of Cowpens, Colonel Tarleton became alarmed for his personal safety, and fearing that his retreat would be cut off, he fled. Tells you something about the nature of the man, I think. Followed by a few of his horsemen. And I have wondered at that point, would he have said to them, "Come on boys, let's get out of here"? Would he have brought them for personal protection? Because I would if I was him. Or are they just seeing, well, the boss is going, I'm going as well? Who knows? We may never know. It might be a mixture of those things. Colonel Washington pursued him. This is William Washington, not George Washington. Pursued him regardless of his own life or the danger that he was in. He outrode all of his men. It's mentioned in other sources that he had a particularly fast horse, incidentally, and that's a really interesting detail, because you have to bear in mind that, unlike motor vehicles, horses can vary quite a lot in speed, and so a lot of cavalry were trained to keep their horses moving at the same speed, but if you were riding solo and you had a fast horse, you could outpace other people. So he outrode all his men and came up with Tarleton and two of the dragoons at his side. and attacking him, he struck with his whole strength at his head. The blow, however, fell short and cut off his queue. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Queue is the French word for tail. But anyway, making another thrust, he wounded 2 of Tarleton's fingers. Very, very important. So, I often mention how important hands are in swordsmanship, and that's why we have hand guards like this one. And swords that don't have this, your hands are more vulnerable. However, you can't completely enclose a hand, and even if you do have a basket hilt, the hands can still get injured. I know people who've had broken fingers through a basket hilt, in fact. But the important thing is that if a hand is wounded in some way, it can make you almost incapacitated. So we often think about, you know, giant cuts at the head and thrusts through the body and things like this, but just wounding a hand can be incredibly important. So he wounded 2 of Tarleton's fingers by his sword passing through the guard of Tarleton's. That actually tells us a few interesting things, if it's accurate. One, that the thrust or cut, whichever it was, went through the guard and wounded him in the hand. But it also tells us that for it to go through the guard, he must have had some form of guard, somewhat a bit like this, that a blade could pass through. Otherwise, they wouldn't mention that it passed through the guard. If he just had a a simple knuckle bow, they wouldn't talk about passing through the guard. Anyway. One of the dragoons now, with his drawn sword, being about to give him a fatal blow, Washington a fatal blow that is, was shot down by one of Washington's men, who rode up at that moment with his pistol. Now, another source mentions quite nicely that this was Washington's, some say a trumpeter, I think bugler, others say a sort of a servant or an aide. But they do mention that this was a small boy, probably, who was unable to wield the sword and hence using a pistol, which I think is an interesting detail. It's like, you're not manly enough to use a sword, you've got to use a pistol. But the fact is that a small bugler, for example, could be a boy at this time, could literally be like a 10-year-old boy who might not have the physicality to use a large cavalry sword, but of course they can still use a pistol. This gave Tarleton the start, and Washington, seeing that the object of his pursuit was now out of reach, returned. The whole British army, with the exception of a few horsemen who fled with Tarleton, was killed or taken prisoners. Now there's another account which gives a little bit more detail than this, which I will recount now. So this version is from Chapin, I think it's French name, Scenes and Incidents in American History 1856. So this is a little bit later, in fact, and this is a little bit more detailed, but I believe it's an American source. This says about the bugler, it says, his little bugler coming up on his right wounded the other aide severely with a pistol shot. The little fellow was unable to wield a sword and thus left him only Tarleton to contend with, because the other dragoons had been shot and dealt with. Like enraged tigers, the respective chiefs now engaged, and rapid as lightning from the mountain cold, the cut and thrust, parry and guard were interchanged. At length, the British colonel received a severe cut across the back of his right hand, so slight difference in the description of the injury there, which disabled him, and he wheeled his horse and fled, and as he did so, drew a pistol, which he discharged at Colonel Washington, wounding him in the knee. Here the conflict closed and the pursuit ended. So you can see it's basically broadly similar, but there are small details that are different. In both cases, pistols were shot both ways. Remember, these are single-shot flintlock pistols. So once your pistol's discharged, assuming you've only got one, or even if you've got two shots, one shot, 2 shots, well, that's it. You're down to swords and bayonets now, boys. There's also an account of something that happened sort of some years later, which is recounted here, and it's an interesting anecdote, and again it's mentioned in different sources, described slightly differently, worded slightly differently, but it seems to be something that actually happened. This defeat caused Colonel Tarleton more unpleasant feelings than anything else during the whole of the Revolution. The following anecdote is often told of him. Being one evening at a tea party with some South Carolina ladies, where the Battle of Cowpens was, who were better Whigs than their husbands, the conversation being about Colonel Washington, William Washington. They spoke very highly of him, At this, Tarleton was much offended and expressed his surprise that the American people thought so much of Colonel Washington, who was an ignorant man and could scarcely write his own name. I mean, at this point, he's practically like a character straight out of a Mel Gibson movie, isn't he? The lady replied, "That may be the case, but no man can better testify that he knows how to make his mark than yourself," alluding, of course, to the loss of Tarleton's fingers. Either at this or at another time he expressed a desire to see Colonel Washington, when one of the ladies coolly replied that if he had looked behind him after the Battle of Cowpens, he could have had that pleasure for himself. So basically, it seems like Tarleton spent years being owned by people at tea parties for running away from Washington. He did go on to have a political career, incidentally, during which he actually used his missing fingers on his right hand as a sort of vote-winning thing to kind of go, look, I was wounded in war, and all of this kind of stuff. So anyway, I thought on the 4th of July you'd like that anecdote where, of course, Colonel Washington came off as the victor, the Battle of Cowpens, a great victory, and Tarleton, who sounds like he was a bit of a getting what he deserved, shall we say. So here's to the 4th of July to all of my viewers. Whether you're American, British or anything else, it's all history now, and I think reading about, learning about history and laughing about history, most important, learning about it. My gosh, if only people learnt more about history, maybe we'd stop repeating the same mistakes. Anyway, I hope this has been enjoyable to watch. If you have any particular periods of history, episodes that you'd like me to interpret and talk about, then feel free, get posting below. Would you like to have more from the American Revolutionary Wars, the Wars of Independence? I can probably dig up more if needs be, and certainly from the earlier wars between Britain and France in America as well, which, as we've seen in previous videos where I talk about tomahawks, there's lots of tomahawk action in some of those, sort of Last of the Mohicans kind of stuff. Anyway, yeah, any particular requests, feel free to post below. I hope this has been enjoyable. Happy 4th of July. Merry Independence Day, whatever you say over there in the colonies, and I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.